One day with Neo at the park by herself, since it was the fourth anniversary of her late partner Roman's passing. Ever since she lost Roman, she had preferred to be left alone from other people, and especially on each anniversary of her late partner's passing, she just avoided most people for the most part. But today, she just sat at the park to just enjoy and remembers the times when she had the good times with Roman. But as she was sitting there, suddenly she heard this very strange, loud sound in the distance, and she saw this also a brief light, and she had no idea what to do. At first, she just tried to ignore this, but for some reason, she was actually even drawn to this place of more curious. So she stood up and walked to the place where she thought this sound or this where the light came from, only they was only seen for a brief second. She came across this small clearing in the park, and she saw this purple animal, or at least like a lizard, on the ground. She had no idea what this kind of were because since it was a lizard, but it was the biggest purple lizard she has ever seen. But it was one other detail that very much caught her off guard, is that this lizard was wearing shoes. And she had never seen any lizard or any other animals wearing shoes. She wasn't really sure how to approach this, so she used her weapon, the umbrella she has, to at least poke on this animal just to see if it was actually alive or not. At first, it didn't respond to any reaction to it, so she thought maybe it was dead. But as she was about to turn around to just walk away, since she thought, now that if this animal is dead, it's nothing to be worried about. But suddenly, as she was turning around, she heard this animal or this lizard suddenly move. She quickly turned around, and sure enough, this lizard opened its eyes and sat up and looked around and saw her. And she saw there was actually a male, and this lizard immediately stood up and just looked at her, and he was trying to communicate with her, but it was pointless because Neo is mute. She can't speak, but she can only communicate with body language or mimic or even text messages since she was mute since birth. And she tried, at least he tried to talk to her, but for some reason he couldn't get any response back. But luckily for her, she saw this sand on the ground near her, and she used her umbrella to at least write a few words saying that she was mute and that she couldn't talk. Then he understood, and he said his name was Espio, and he asked for her name. She said, wrote down on the sand that her name was Neo. He asked her where he were, and or at least something like that, and she said that he was on Remnant, and he had no idea of what things like it, because he told her he had never heard of the word or the place called Remnant before. She somehow laughed, even though it didn't make much sound. It's because that she thought that he was joking. But when she saw that he was quite serious, she was actually surprised that he had never heard of Remnant before. But suddenly, as they heard some voices in the distance, she quickly turned around and saw there were a few people. But then, as she turned around the back to look at Espio, he was gone. And she was surprised because she didn't actually hear him walk away or run away, or at least jump away or something. But after those voices left, she looked around again, and suddenly he was there. She was like, how has it been possible? And then he explained that he has ability to turn himself invisible. Then he showed her again. She was just nodded and told herself, like in her mind, that's impressive. She has never seen anything like it. But as it was suddenly started to get suddenly it started to rain. And suddenly Neo just made a sign by her hand that he would follow. Then he made himself invisible and just followed her behind. They actually went to a small place where she lived. And at the place, Neo gave him a palette or some form of tablet that he wrote his message that he could write down the messages or if she wanted. But since he wrote on it that he can talk normally, she will understand because she also is only mute. So they start talking, and after a while, it was actually something they both really connected to. She uh, she mentioned that today was her late partner's passing, and he said that he was sorry to hear that. She then asked him how it was possible that he doesn't know where Remnant is and how he ended up there. Well, he then mentioned that he was along with some friends fighting against an enemy, and that this this enemy used a machine, and it contained some powerful emeralds or magical stones, and something went wrong, and he believes that he was teleported from that world to another one. And even though Neo will had hesitated to believe this, then she asked if he had those emeralds with him. But he shook his head and said no, they're probably back in his own world, or if they were in this new world, they would probably been scattered. Because he mentioned that after they had been used, they were scattered around the world and only being searched for again. They can only be used once. After that, they've probably been scattered around the world. And the conversation actually continued for a while. And she decided to let him stay there for a while since she didn't had much that he didn't have any other place to go. But during this time, he had learned more about Remnant, more about Neo, that she didn't have any family anymore, and about the Grimms and all about her abilities and all that. He was actually quite impressed. But even though he did miss Mobius from time to time, but knowing there was no way for him to get back, he decided to simply stay there, and he was actually considering to leave Neo and find somewhere else to live. But he didn't know where to go, since this was a whole new world. That means 4 new kingdoms to search around and explore. But at least he had one advantage. He can always make himself invisible so that he wouldn't be detected. And his skills of findings could also be an advantage. But that was all the things about it. But during his time staying with Neo, he learned that she could be cruel, vicious, and sadistic, and very strong at that. But for some reason, even though that she could be very highly determined to get her things what she said on it, but during her time to get to know Espio, somehow something inside her changed. It was like her heart was beating a bit faster, because for somehow, in an unknown way, Espio kind of reminded her of Roman for some reason. And she first believed maybe this could have been Roman, but somehow reincarnated into a new, strange being. But after a while of testing him about this idea, or if he could somehow remember, but in the end, she realized Espio wasn't a reincarnated form of Roman. But after they had been living together for about almost a month, Neo wrote and asked Espio what he was going to do now. She was told that he had been thinking for the past few days that he was ready to leave. But she asked him where would he go. And he didn't know exactly, because even though he had learned more about the kingdoms from the books she has, it was really something unusual. He couldn't just pick one of the 4 kingdoms to go to. And even though he wanted to go to one of the world's kingdoms to just explore, but he did leave Neo's home from time to time, but he went around the town invisible. So that he explored and interacted with the people, while at least observed the people in hiding, so that he would know more about them, more about their culture and all that. But after a while, Espio started to realize it couldn't leave. Not because that he didn't want to, but it was that after I've been staying with Neo for about a month by this point, he actually have felt a little bit of attraction towards her. Even though that she could have been a little bit cruel or vicious or something like that, but somehow she showed this soft spot herself. And just to have been interacted with him had made her had changed personality. Rather than being from a vicious and very cruel personality before, now she is more soft spoken. Even though at first most of the things was really strange. But one day, when she was along with Espio in public, there was something about it when suddenly, when a few people heard Espio sneeze, even though he was invisible, and there were other people around, and they saw it was not Neo. And suddenly, as he sneezed again, he lost control, the focus of his invisibility. He turned visible again, and people immediately start screaming that a Grim has suddenly showed up in town, being this invisible. It didn't take long for several other people to show up to fight off this supposed Grim. But when the people showed up, they saw it wasn't even a Grim, because it was a lizard. And in fact, this was an actually intelligent being, since he could talk. And Neo stood in front of him and tried to communicate with her text messages or mimic or something like that, or at least sign language that she has started to learn, that he's not enemy, he's a friend. Moreover, she's actually had feelings for this guy. And the others was very hesitating to believe this. Because ever since these people knew about Neo, and even especially about her passing of Roman. So after Roman passed, she had almost cut herself off the society. But they have seen a different side, because when she stood in front of Espio, she actually looked scared and even crying. And Espio stood by her side then and said that he knows that these people would accept him as a part of the society. And he told them that it's probably for the best that he just leave without causing any more further problem. But Neo grabbed his arm and shook her head, said for no, that she wanted him to stay. And then he asked her why. Then she wrote down on a tablet that she loves him. And he said, "You really love me?" She nodded her head while crying, and the people actually saw this. They were just surprised because this was a whole different personality of hers. But after a while, Espio and Neo actually recognized, or at least confessed each other's feelings. But even it took some time for other people around them to actually accept Espio and Neo, even though Neo wouldn't have much friends around her, but eventually some people start to accept her as the new personality. They started being dating though. Espio and Neo started dating, and Espio, for some reason, he couldn't actually start thinking about Neo. And after they had been dating for about 4 months, for about 4 years, Espio actually proposed to Neo. And Neo, she said yes immediately. She couldn't believe that Espio proposed to her. She was just happy that he did. They decided to have a small weddings, And and since she didn't have any family alive anymore, so it would only been perhaps only a few people that they had now made as friends. And even at the wedding reception afterwards, people could see how happy that Neo were, because seeing her smiling, it was the most amazing that they ever thought of her. Because in her past, she has always been such a cruel person, fighting off for anything. But now, ever since she met Espio, she had changed. She had actually have a more softer spot herself. Even all the guests could see how happy Neo were when she was dancing or interacted with Espio during the wedding reception. She was just happy that she had found someone else to be with. She couldn't have been happier to have found her true love with Espio. And after they had been married for 3 years, Espio and Neo wanted to start a family of their own. But there was a small problem for them. They couldn't have any children of their own. But then they decided to adopt some children of their own instead. So they went to this local orphanage. They adopted a boy and a girl, siblings. The boy was named Ling and the girl was named Sapphire. Even though at first both Ling and Sapphire was really hesitating to even want to be near the new adoptive father. After all, he was a lizard. But after they saw his ability to turn invisible and uninvisible and his fighting skills, they were quite impressed, and eventually they had no problem with him. Even though at first they have a little bit of a problem to communicate with the new mom, after all, since Neo was mute. But luckily for her, or at least for them, that they could communicate with text messages, and they actually were just happy to have a new family of their own. After all, ever since they lost their own parents in an accident, they would just had this biggest hope and wishes that they could find someone who would adopt them as a new family. And even at first, even though that Espio at first could understand why Ling and Sapphire was avoiding him as much as he was not a human. But after he was showing them how his true kindness and his abilities, and also that he was very, very dedicated to his new family and he would always protect them. And even this, even Espio did train Ling on some of his ninja skills, and it was actually very proving. Even though Sapphire was hesitating to believe that she wouldn't have been allowed to be taught the same thing. But Espio told her that he would, because he believed in equality. So after a while, after many years, both Ling and Sapphire would eventually become a hunter and a huntress. And both at the time, Espio and Neo couldn't be more happier to have a family of their own. Even at the time, just shortly after that Espio arrived in the small town, at first he didn't know what to do. Ever since he was considering just simply leave and find someone else to live. But after he was actually interacted with more with Neo, and after he was defended by her from other people believing that he was an evil spirit, or at least an evil dark evil one. And after that, he felt very deep gratitude to her. And he had repeated that multiple times over and over. And by doing this, he also showed his true, deep, passionate love for Neo. And Neo herself couldn't be happier to have this amazing guy in her life. And not only that, but having two children of their own together. And this is how Neo and Espio found their true love, got a family together. The end.